Now, bearing in mind that this being is the creator of everything, there's got to be some pretty major benefits of having a relationship with such a being, if this relationship is personal and not just a general idea or concept. So I would say the very first thing that we need to discuss is what the major benefit is. We have a relationship with the actual creator, or the potential of having one, with the actual creator of the universe. Now, the creator of the universe knows everything that's inside of the universe, because he created it. Now, if I have a relationship with that creator, I then have the potential to somehow learn everything that he knows. And if I have that potential, then in the end, I can get to know everything in the universe as well. Absolutely everything. Scientifically, mathematically, creatively, everything that's possible that we can engage, because this creator knows everything and has created the potential for everything in the universe that we live in. It would make sense that if I have a relationship with this person, this being, then I have the potential to learn everything from that being through this relationship. Now, if that's the case, then to me that is one of the greatest possible reasons to engage the relationship. So I'm not talking about just having a sort of a religious concept. So I'm not talking about generally just a religious concept. You know, this general concept that mankind has about God, or you have to worship God. I'm more talking about something that's much more personal than that, where you actually can feel God's nature, qualities and attributes, and God educates you through the relationship, rather than just it being a case of you having to go to church Sunday or go and worship God or honour God. Because it's not just about honouring God. I feel it's more than that. It's about growing in this relationship where we have a to and fro conversation with God, where everything between us and God flows in terms of emotionally flows. Just like you would have a relationship with a person who's your partner or a friend, you can have a relationship with God which will encompass and make you grow in all sorts of directions that you wouldn't have conceived possible before. And the reason why is because God knows everything about where we live. And God knows everything about our body. God knows everything about our spirit body. God knows everything about our soul. God knows everything about our personality. God knows everything about the world in which we live. Scientifically, he knows everything that he created. He created the mathematics and the science. He knows all of those things. So the more I come closer to this being, God, who knows all these things, it would logically make sense that I will also grow in my knowledge of exactly those same things. And it would be much easier for me to do so than connecting with any other person. So it also helps me, if you like, prevents me from it. I need to do less experimentation. When I say less, what I mean by that is, in my life, the way I generally learn is by experimenting, right? I experiment with something, a concept, an idea, and eventually I test it through a lot of different actions that I might take. And eventually I arrive at generally what I believe to be true as a result of those experiments. The beauty of having a direct connection with God is that God can tell me things that I then can experiment with, that I don't have to go and discover for myself as much. And what that means then is I have the potential to learn more rapidly. I have the potential to learn about the entire universe much more rapidly than I would by having to experiment on my own right. Does that make sense? I could potentially learn directly from the being who created it, and therefore understand it much more easily than I could have potentially understood before. And so that then makes things a lot more it makes my growth a lot faster as a result. I can grow faster and grow towards understanding things faster through this relationship. Is there any questions you have about that? No? So how do you guys feel about a relationship with God, like in terms of a concept? Like, Joy?
I was just reflecting that it's about having the willingness to learn from God, because in my self-reliance, the way I've done everything in this life is not to ask anybody anything.
Yeah.
Just live by trial and error.
Exactly.
And my observation is that that's what most of us do.
Yeah.
And I don't know why that's so ingrained, but it's been a real switch for me to go from that I have to do everything kind of thing to in this case, accepting, well, God knows everything and I can learn that way. It's that switch, it's that willingness to want and that desire to want to do that.
Yes, like I drew earlier, how there's me and I can live in a bubble, if we like, when it comes to God. I can, or live, by learning from the world around me. The problem with that, of course, is I have to experiment with it. And the other problem is that I'll generally attract a whole series of events which I then interpret a certain way. And because my interpretations are not universal in their nature, I will often misinterpret it. So I will often not have a good perspective, if you like. It's like when you stand here on the mount at Bathurst, you can overlook the entire valley and so see how the valley is laid out. But when you go down into the valley and just live in the valley, you forget how everything's laid out, like because of you being actually in the valley, and the perspective has changed. And if we gain God's perspective, that is a universal perspective. It's a very different type of perspective than our individual perspective. And through this relationship with God, we have the potential to actually see everything as God sees it. And in that process, we have the ability to see it as it really is, because that's how God sees everything. Right? But instead, what we often do is we forget about God, forget about a relationship with God on earth, and then we only have the ability to see it how we see it. And how we see is often quite limited and distorted because of our perspective. Because of where we are even living in the universe, there is a certain degree of distortion that occurs through what we observe. And whereas with God, we get to, if we connect to God, we get to see things how God sees them, which is a very, very different perspective than how we generally see it ourselves. And I feel that's a major benefit of our relationship with God, to actually begin to see things as they really are, rather than how I interpret them to be. Now, to do that, I've got to be pretty humble. I've got to be also pretty, not very self-reliant and more God-reliant in that interpretation. But again, if I have a relationship with God, I could even develop those qualities of being less self-reliant, more God-reliant, more humble in my relationship with God, more willing to learn like a student, rather than thinking that I know everything and therefore don't need to be taught anything, those kind of things. And if I have a relationship with God, then I'm completely free to be taught everything that's possible to learn, in any possible direction or passion that I have. And that includes music, art, science, mathematics, any passion you can consider. We have the ability to learn the truth of it and ability to utilize it in a loving manner if we connect to this relationship with God. Yeah. Okay, is there any other questions or statements you'd like to make about that? Okay. So, if God sees things as they really are, and this is me and I have this limited viewpoint of how things are, obviously through this relationship with God, certain things are going to be, if I embrace it, this relationship, certain things are going to be forced upon me. One of the things that will be forced upon me is that I will need to change. In other words, I need to change from the limited being I currently are into a completely different type of being who has the ability to absorb the information that God wants to give us. So I see God as the same as any human parent on earth who is loving towards their child. And when I say the same, far exceeds any loving person on earth who's loving towards their child. Now, any parent who's loving towards their child on earth generally wants their child to learn the easiest possible way. Is that not the case? You're always trying to protect your child from having hardship through the process of learning. You want them to learn even from your own experience to a degree, so that they don't have or embrace the same problems that you've had to experience in your life with learning. There's also this feeling that is in most good parents on earth who are loving towards their children, that they would like the child to even exceed their own understanding of things in the long run. They want to, in fact, most good parents want to create what I would call an atmosphere or an environment of learning, so it's so easy for the child to learn that the child just automatically absorbs new truths without even realizing it sometimes, just through this process of learning. And I feel God is far better than the average parent on earth. So therefore, God wants us to also absorb new truths, and God wants us to do it as easily as we possibly can. And the easiest possible way we could absorb more truth is by having a relationship with God, where there is a to and from emotional experience between us and God, and a learning experience between us and God. And as that experience occurs, now we have the ability to understand a whole heap of new things that we would not have before been able to understand without that relationship. And that relationship with God will also challenge us in certain ways. So, for example, let's have a look how it will challenge me. There are some truths that God knows, and obviously, if we can put it even more defined than that, there must be an infinite number of truths that this being must know to create what seems or appears to be an infinite universe. And if that is the case, then there is an infinite number of truths that can be transmitted from God to me. But for me to be able to absorb them, I'm going to have to change. I'm going to have to be in a condition to absorb them somehow. My intellect, for example, is going to have to grow in order to absorb some of these truths. My experience of emotions is going to have to grow in order for me to experience some of these truths. Because if it doesn't grow, then how can I get the truth from God that God already experiences and knows without there being some kind of growth on my part? So what I see is one of the benefits of our relationship with God is that it causes me to grow. I'm going to grow in my intellectual capacity to understand. I'm going to grow in my emotional capacity to understand every single thing. I will not, in fact, if I continue with this relationship with God, my soul will be transformed in such a way that I have the capacity to understand things that I now currently do not understand. So right now there's a whole heap of things, because we're not God, there must be a whole almost infinite number of things that we don't understand. Like if you look at most of us have no idea how our body works even. Many times we don't even know the purpose of an organ in our body that's a major organ, let alone how our entire body works. When we get sick, we don't understand why most of the time. We blame it on a flu or a virus or something like that, but we have no understanding of why we caught it. Because if we understood why we caught it and understood there is a cause, we would remove that cause and then we'd never catch one again. Right? So we don't even understand why we caught it. We don't have the capacity even for many of us to understand. What I'm saying is a relationship with God can grow our soul in such a manner that we have the capacity to understand why these things happen. And therefore, we have the capacity to change them. We have the capacity to influence our life in so many different areas of change as a result. Does that make sense? Okay.